for joining today to the third installment of our honors thesis presentation. All the students that you see today have toiled for an entire year, and now they show you the fruits of their labor. As you might already know, everybody has about 20 minutes to speak, and then we have 10-ish minutes for Q&A, and then it's the next speaker's turn. Traditionally, the first question goes to the advisors, and I see some of them already in the room. And so that I don't cut too much into Sophie's time, I'll just announce this. So the first student today who's going to present is Sophie Donnellan with The Art of Strategic Securitization, a discursive analysis of climate mobility in international organizations. Take it away, Sophie.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Donnellan, and I'll be presenting my thesis, The Art of Strategic Securitization, a discursive analysis of climate mobility in international organizations. About 1 year ago, I was sailing on a tall ship called the Robert C. Seamans in French Polynesia through the program Stanford at Sea. And we had the opportunity to visit multiple islands, including the atoll of Howe, which is pictured here. And while at Howe, our cohort had the opportunity to meet with the mayor of the island, who discussed some of the challenges that the island is confronting. I translated from French to English as she talked about how the threat that climate change poses to their life in Howe. And one of the most memorable quotes that I translated from her was "Demain on sera des réfugiés," which in English means tomorrow we will be refugees. But what does it mean to be a climate refugee? Yone Toitiota is from the island of Kiribati, and he moved from Kiribati with his family to New Zealand in 2007 because climate change had rendered his lifestyle untenable. Waves had crashed over the seawall, flooding his family's compound on multiple occasions, and there was a lack of access to drinkable water. Several years later, his visa had inadvertently expired, and his attorney filed for him to receive refugee status. But international law does not consider that climate-displaced individuals constitute as individuals that can receive refugee status. And so in 2015, he was deported back to Kiribati. His story not only reveals that there is a legal gap in the international governance of climate mobility, but it also points to a broader issue where the institutions that are set out to govern climate mobility do not actually do much to protect the individuals who are displaced, rather focusing on preventing climate mobility from occurring in the first place. This is not for a lack of security rhetoric on the topic. In 2023, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, "We would witness a mass exodus of entire populations on a biblical scale when talking about the impact of climate change on human mobility." Why then, despite this apocalyptic rhetoric, has there been insufficient governance of climate mobility at the international level? To address this broader puzzle, my thesis investigates the more narrow question of why do states securitize climate mobility, or frame it through a security lens, in international organizations. My presentation will proceed as follows. I will begin with reviews of definitions, literature, and theory. I will then move to my hypotheses and methodology. I will next discuss my results and analysis, and I will conclude with findings and policy considerations. So taking a step back, what is climate mobility? A helpful way to conceptualize it is by looking at it on a scale of these two axes. One goes from involuntary consequence to choice, which is thinking about how much agency or decision a person has in moving, whether they are forced to move or choose to move to avoid climate disaster. The other is immobility to mobility, which is whether a person does end up moving or stays put. To encompass this broader purview of what climate mobility might mean, I define it broadly in my thesis as cases in which climate change causes people to move. Next, to understand why countries securitize climate mobility, it is important to first understand what is securitization. When you think of traditional international security topics, some might come to mind like war, terrorism, and nuclear weapons. But scholars of securitization assert that other topics like global pandemics and environmental degradation might also be considered security topics. And this is done through securitizing acts, where actors intentionally label issues as security threats in speeches or other means to a relevant audience. If the relevant audience accepts this securitizing act, then the topic will become securitized. So my research will investigate these securitizing acts in the form of speeches in international organizations. Now, how might climate mobility be securitized? Through a review of the limited literature on the topic, I found that scholars assert there are three ways in which climate mobility can be securitized. The first is through a national security framing, where migrants who are displaced by climate change are identified as a threat to the state. The second is a human security victim framing, where climate change is identified as a threat to humans who are forced to move because they are forced to move, which differs from the human security agent framing, where climate change is again identified as a threat to humans, but them being able to move away from the problem is actually a solution. So the climate mobility is less of the threat, and climate change is the threat to the people. With these framings established, we can now ask the question, why securitize? There are two competing but relatively understudied theories on this topic. The first is presented by scholar Ingrid Boas, who asserts that states securitize for policy elevation. This is more in line with traditional securitization theory. She believes that countries who have a desire to make certain topics more prominent in international organizations to achieve their own policy agendas will be the ones who decide to securitize climate mobility. On the other hand, Sabrina Arias put forth a novel theory of securitization for agenda control. She looked at the securitization of climate change in the UN General Assembly and found that states decide to securitize climate change because they want to garner more agenda control. Specifically, this means that the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council were the ones who used the most security language and rhetoric around climate change. Because if climate change moves from the UN General Assembly to the more limited Council of the UN Security Council, these 5 states are going to have more control over the topic. In order to find out which of these theories ends up being more at play with climate mobility, I looked at the question of who securitizes. And this brings me to my hypotheses and methodology. So my 2 hypotheses are derived directly from these 2 theories. The first, states securitize for agenda control, specifically the P5 states of the UN Security Council. And second, states securitize for policy prioritization. To break down this second hypothesis a bit more, I found 3 possible policies that states might be seeking to prioritize. So hypothesis H2A is that states securitize to prioritize migration policy, and then I have climate change policy, and the more narrow topic of climate mobility. So how might I actually test these? I turn to 3 comparisons. If states seek to securitize climate mobility for agenda control, we might expect that the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council are the main securitizers, that they would securitize climate mobility more frequently and more aggressively than other countries. If states seek to securitize to influence their own migration policy agendas, we would expect there to be a difference between states who are net senders of migrants and states that are net recipients of migrants. And we might expect that the sender states would use more human security framings, and the recipient states would use more national security framings. If states securitize climate mobility in an effort to promote their climate change policy agendas, we would expect there to be differences between pre-established blocks that exist in the negotiations of climate change policy. So I looked at 4 particular blocks, which are identified here. First, small island developing states, which are hard to see on this map because of their small size, are states that we might expect to securitize climate mobility very vocally because they want to receive more resources for adaptation to climate change, for loss and damage funding, as well as global mitigation. Sub-Saharan African countries are similarly quite vulnerable, but often less vocal on these issues, and so we might expect them to securitize in a bit of a less vocal way. The EU and umbrella countries are countries that are fully industrialized, so European Union and other countries like the United States, as you can see in blue on this map. And we might expect that these countries would securitize climate mobility to promote mitigation of emissions. And then finally, the like-minded developing countries are states that are currently developing with fossil fuels and assert that they have a right to develop. And they believe that the onus on mitigating emissions might fall more on the EU and umbrella countries that are already industrialized. And therefore, we might expect that they would be less frequent contributors to the climate mobility rhetoric, and especially securitized rhetoric, in order to avoid any kind of responsibility for themselves to mitigate their emissions. So this helps us understand how we can test these hypotheses. For agenda control, we look to P5 versus non-P5. For policy prioritization, it depends on the policy that's being prioritized. For migration, we look to sender versus recipient states. For climate change, we look to differences between climate coalitions. Finally, for climate mobility, because it's a more narrow topic, I look specifically to the content of the speeches, if any of them are actually discussing the governance of climate mobility. So the bodies that I actually look to investigate my hypotheses are the UN General Assembly and the Conference of the Parties, or COP speeches. And these are 2 bodies where states give annual speeches that have been taking place over a long period of time where climate mobility might come up. In the UNGA, countries discuss global issues. COP is a body where countries negotiate on climate change policies, and so they give speeches related to climate change. And I investigate these speeches through a technique called structural topic modeling. Structural topic modeling is a helpful way to analyze discourse, and I'm going to walk through how this process works. So we can imagine that these speeches from the UNGA and COP are broken down into speech segments or paragraphs. So these are represented by the orange boxes here. Now, because let's say in the UN General Assembly, we have speech segments that could discuss a variety of topics, we're only interested in looking at the climate mobility speeches, I run a filter to identify the speech segments that only discuss climate change related topics. So that's represented by the boxes in purple. So once I only have the UNGA speeches that are discussing climate change, I then do the same thing with human mobility. Out of the climate change speeches, which ones are also discussing climate mobility, I'm eventually left with only speech segments on climate mobility. So from these, I'm now interested in understanding the different ways that actors frame climate mobility. And these could be called topical frames. What the structural topic modeling technique does is it identifies the speeches that share in common certain words that are used most frequently or uniquely amongst these speeches, and it separates these into distinct topics. And so that's what I end up analyzing in my results and analysis. In the UNGA, I was left with 344 speech segments that discuss climate mobility. And I ended up having 4 topics that the structural topic model identified. To actually figure out what these topics represent, I looked at the 15 most correlated speech segments from each topic to try to find any kind of thematic consistencies. In topic 1, I found rhetoric like protect the human rights of people displaced, and I identified this as a human security topic. In topic 2, I found rhetoric like the fight against climate change and irregular migration, and I identified this as a national security topic, although I noted that in this topic, often climate change and human migration were noted as distinct topics, so they weren't always talking about climate mobility as linked together. Topic 3 had the most extreme security rhetoric. So we see quotes like, our greenhouse gas emissions are not falling fast enough. How much more scorched earth? How many millions more climate refugees? How many flood victims will it take to convince us that ignoring our commitments is no longer an option? I identified this topic as existential sovereignty. In this topic, countries used extreme security rhetoric to promote the idea that because of climate mobility, as an example of a very extreme consequence of climate change, there needed to be more climate action taken, both in the terms of mitigating emissions and also providing funding to countries who needed it. Topic 4 had quotes like the magnitude of the contemporary challenges that the world is confronting, from climate change to terrorism, from economic inequality to irregular migration, from protracted crises to humanitarian emergencies, demands action. I noted this as a listing of global challenges. Like topic 2, we often see that climate change and human migration are not listed together and rather kept quite separate. And I also identified this as a technique of securitization through association. These topics weren't directly called security threats, but because they were noted alongside other traditional security threats like terrorism, they were indirectly securitized. So this brings me to the 4 topics that I was able to identify through the structural topic modeling technique. From here, because these are all securitized flavors of climate mobility, I'm interested in looking to my hypotheses. What can we learn from the different ways that countries are using these framings? First, let's turn to agenda control. The permanent 5 countries of the UN Security Council mostly treat climate change and human mobility as separate issues, with their speech segments falling under topics 2 and 4. In addition, they often contribute at the same rate per country as the global average, which is about 1.78 speeches per country. So in this way, we see that the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council are not securitizing more aggressively or more frequently than other countries in the UN General Assembly, which leads us to believe that agenda control is not a reason why states are securitizing climate mobility in the UNGA. So now let's look at policy prioritization, but it's unclear which of the policies is being prioritized. We know already from our understanding of what these different topical frames are that it's likely not climate mobility, because we don't see any rhetoric on the actual governance of climate mobility coming up frequently in these speeches. But what can we learn from comparisons of different countries about the migration and climate change sides of the policy prioritization? So turning to migration, we're comparing the sender and recipient countries of migrants. we see that there is no statistically significant difference in the topical frames that are used in the speech segments on climate mobility by sender and recipient countries, when also comparing them to the global average. In addition, they speak at a roughly the same rate, again, as the 1.78 speeches per country of global average. And so from here, we can understand that migration is likely not a policy that's being prioritized through the securitization of climate mobility. So finally, we turn to the hypothesis of climate change. To do this, we compare the different climate coalitions. So here we see that the different climate coalitions do vary quite significantly in the topical frames that they're employing in the UN General Assembly on climate mobility. And we can learn a bit more about how this relates to their climate change agendas by looking more closely at these different groups. So in the presentation, I'll focus on the small island developing states. If we zoom in on what the small island developing states are contributing to the climate mobility filter, we see that they are very frequent contributors to the existential sovereignty topic. And this is at a statistically significant rate. So the existential sovereignty topic is a topic that is focusing on how the rights and sovereignty of these states are at risk due to climate change. And this is a motivation for them to impose that other countries should be mitigating their emissions and for them to receive funding as well. And so this helps us understand that small island developing states' priorities are well aligned with how they're talking about climate mobility in the UNGA when it comes to their climate change policies. And we also see that this is consistent with climate coalition participation as a whole. So the global rate, again, is 1.78 speech segments per country. Countries, coalitions that have the onus to promote mitigation of emissions and climate change action more broadly, like the small island developing states, sub-Saharan African states, and the EU and umbrella coalitions, contribute at a rate that exceeds the global average. On the other hand, like-minded developing countries are the least incentivized to promote climate action, and they also are the least significant contributors out of these groups. So this helps us to understand that in the UN General Assembly, the prioritization of climate change agendas and policies is a main reason why states securitize climate mobility. I did similar analysis in COP, and I found that while the COP topics differed a bit from the UNGA topics, they ultimately did have arrive at the same conclusion that the reason why states securitize climate mobility is for the strategic promotion of climate change agendas. So this brings me finally to my findings and policy considerations. I leave this thesis with the understanding that there are different flavors of securitization when it comes to climate mobility being spoken about in international organizations. I find that there is little emphasis on human security, which was something that was brought up a lot in the scholarly discourse. I also find that there's a technique being used that is securitization through association. And these, I think, would both be interesting to study more in further research. I also answered the question of why securitize climate mobility and find that the reason is for the strategic promotion of climate change agendas. At the beginning of this presentation, I asked the question of why so little progress has been made to govern climate mobility at the international level. I reveal that because climate change is a tool in international organizations to promote climate change agendas and not climate mobility governance, this might be part of the reason why we're seeing so little progress to govern climate mobility. It speaks to a broader trend where countries are doing the important work of addressing climate change as a root cause of climate mobility. But at the same time, it's important not to be leaving the individuals who are the most vulnerable and affected by climate change, like Ione Teitiota, and leaving them vulnerable to the actual consequences of climate displacement. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll leave you with my takeaways.
All right, thank you very much, Sophie. The first question, as I mentioned, I see you. The first question, as I mentioned, always goes to the advisor. So Professor Schultz first, and then Professor Benedict, please.
Great, thanks, Sophie. That was an awesome presentation of a great thesis. It's been fun working with you on this. So I'm going to ask you kind of a big question, kind of to think beyond the implications of your findings, which is, what do you think international cooperation on this issue could look like, and what would it take to get there?
I think that's a great question. Thank you, Professor Schultz. And we've talked a bit about what international institutions exist that work to govern climate mobility, like the Task Force on Displacement and the MECC, which is under the International Organization on Migration, and that the actual mandates of these organizations is more to prevent, avert, and minimize climate mobility from occurring and not actually help the individuals who are displaced. Ultimately, I think that even if an organization were to try to do more of the protecting and providing resources for individuals who are displaced by climate change, they would be limited by the constraints of international law. So I think that's where the main change would need to come from if we're actually able to address this at the international level. As long as there are no international legal protections for people who are displaced by climate change, these types of situations where individuals like Mr. Teitiota, who end up displaced because of climate change and unable to have international legal protections, is going to keep occurring. So I think ultimately, I think what countries need to do is focus on the international legal frameworks and the gaps that exist there.
Great. Professor Benaviste, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, Sophie, great presentation. A lot of fun to work with you on this. A couple, I guess, questions specifically on the findings. One thing that I think struck everybody in the room is like kind of the small number of speech segments that each country, spends on this issue. I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about how you think about how that might affect your results and kind of the robustness of it. And then the second question that I had was that even though you show very clearly kind of different patterns across climate coalitions of, how many countries are going to talk about this topic versus that topic a bit less frequently, we see that most groupings still use all framings kind of. And so how do you think about those framings being, in essence, apparently not mutually exclusive, but actually kind of being used all at the same time?
Yeah. Is there anything I use some extra stuff?
No, go ahead.
So I actually have a way to visualize the speech segments that discuss climate mobility, and this is for the UN General Assembly. So remember, we were left with 344 speech segments, and this is out of a total of over 1 million speech segments that I was able to break down from the corpus that was from 1946 to 2022. We see that they begin to talk about climate mobility in 2015, but even so, this is a really small proportion of the total speech segments. And so I think this is interesting, showing that in the UN General Assembly, it makes sense that there's a lot to talk about international problems that aren't climate mobility, but in general, it really is under discussed. I think that this might also be a contributing factor, other than the fact that it's being used as a tool to promote climate change agendas. This might also explain some of why there's been so little action, because countries are not necessarily talking about it. When they do, they're using it in this way as a tool to promote climate change agendas. In addition, yes, we see that even though there are different, this is for COP in the UNGA, we have the different climate coalitions contributing at different rates to the different topics, there is still some consistency of them contributing to every topic. I think that this might speak in part to the fact that the structural topic modeling is not a perfect technique when identifying topical frames in a topic that's already pretty niche. And because it's looking at word frequency and the word uniqueness that's shared amongst these topics, there are some imperfections in how it went about identifying them. I think other than that, it speaks to the idea that all of these countries are, listing global challenges, talking about, existential sovereignty concerns, talking about human security. They're just doing so in ways that reflect that they have different priorities when it comes to these issues, that some of them are more important to them than others.
One idea that I think is really interesting that comes through in your research is the idea that topics can be climatized just as they can be securitized. And I'm curious if you have a view on what are climate topics, the same way that you did a great job. I loved the way you defined securitization and that you showed topics that are becoming security topics or that can be deemed security topics. What are climate topics today, and what are the new, what climate topics will be on the horizon as climate change changes?
Thanks, Izzo, for that question. That's actually something I talk about a bit in my discussion section. This idea of climatization is the idea that certain topics are becoming known as topics that are only viewed through a climate change lens. And I think this is also part of the problem that we see here, where because climate mobility is viewed through such a climate lens as a tool to promote climate action, the actual human mobility and human vulnerability side of the story is what's being left to the wayside. I think in addition to climate mobility, we see topics like climate and food insecurity, or climate and disease, which Reina did a great job in her presentation discussing that intersection. And I think that also climate and development these are topics that we're starting to see more through a climate change angle. And it's not always exclusively, but as the climate change intersection grows stronger, we'll be seeing more of this climatization occurring with these topics in the future.
I think we have time for one more question. Can we take the one way in the back, please? Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Sophie, for a fantastic presentation. I had sort of a broader question on your thoughts about general like securitization topics. So right now I'm thinking specifically about like a place like Pakistan that's, you know, faces a lot of climate issues, maybe with like heat waves that will, I think, probably generate climate refugees in the near future. But Pakistan also generates refugees for other reasons. You mentioned a couple of them, like food insecurity or conflict. And I wanted to know if through your research, you've developed any thoughts about sort of the conflicting securitizations of migration, maybe for like a place like Pakistan, where there might be like climate issues, but also other issues that are generating refugees. And if you have thoughts on like if countries might opt to think like look at refugees through a single lens for whatever reason, or if there might be different conflicting priorities and how sort of like different security topics will interact with climate change as climate mobility becomes a bigger problem over time.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. We definitely see sort of a triangle intersection of human mobility, climate change, and also general instability and insecurity in countries like war and conflict. We saw this a bit with the Syrian civil war, where there was a civil war that had some amount of climate instability that could be argued contributed to this conflict. And there was also a great number of Syrian refugees from this crisis. And so the linkage of the violence and conflict, climate change, and migration are all being studied here. I think that the complexities of these linkages is really important to study and also hard to study. But ultimately, I guess to address this question, I would say that we should consider that climate and human mobility are important intertwined topics, and that we need more research to be done on what these linkages are and how they might continue to grow stronger in the future, what this might mean for securitization and the study of climate mobility moving forward. Thank you.
Fantastic. Then I think we're out of time for your slot. So please join me in thanking here, Isabel Tsai with Cautious Wolf Warrior, International and Domestic Drivers Behind China's Diplomatic Rhetoric. You can set up and we just leave a minute for everyone to.
Yeah, where's Marie? Where's Marie?
Congratulations.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead.
Oh, that's fine.
Maybe another 20 seconds for people to come.
You're presenting today?
Yeah. It's like a big protection.
No, I'm just.
You want me to sit underneath?
All right, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I mean, you can think a Chinese movie for that one.
Yeah, we'll come in as soon as you can. Just People coming.
Oh my God, okay. I'll start
Yeah,
regardless.
go ahead, Isabel.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Isabel Tai, senior majoring in political science and East Asian studies. I'm presenting my honors thesis, Cautious Wolf Warrior, Domestic and International Drivers Behind China's Diplomatic Rhetoric, advised by Professor Toms. I'd like to begin with what motivated my research. In the late 2010s, the image of Chinese diplomats shifted from the courteous and cautious envoy of Deng Xiaoping's hide and bite era into a more combative wolf warrior. This term, borrowed from a popular action movie franchise, quickly became a journalistic shorthand for Beijing's new diplomatic style. It is characterized by nationalist narratives, public rebukes of critics, and aggressive social media engagement. However, when I looked through statements published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in my past research assistant roles, the wolf warriors do not always roar with similar volumes. For example, this is what spokesperson Hua Chunying said in 2018 when a US naval vessel traveled close to Mischief Reef, a long disputed territory between China and the Philippines, a forceful threat. At the same time, a similar incident in 2023, when a Philippine naval vessel sailed close to the Second Thomas Shoal, China, at least to me, had a much more conciliatory tone. So while the wolf warrior term sounds like a cool buzzword, I thought this narrative is too simplistic, overlooking the actual variations in China's diplomatic rhetoric and stuffing everything into the black box of authoritarian policymaking. So these observations led me to ask, what drives the variations across time and in between countries in China's diplomatic rhetoric? For the rest of the presentation, I will begin with a little bit of background for those of you not familiar with the South China Sea issue, and then present my main hypotheses, which derive from existing scholarship on other forms of aggression, such as physical aggression. Then I will describe my methods involving sentiment and statistical analysis of an original data set. Finally, I present my findings, first summary data analysis, and then the estimated effects of economic dependence and domestic socio-economic problems on China's diplomatic aggression. I will conclude with how these observations suggest about China's foreign policy making. So I use the South China Sea issue as a case study for my thesis. And for those of you less familiar with the region, the South China Sea issue involves overlapping territorial and maritime claims between China and its Southeast Asian neighbors, Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, and Vietnam. So while China uses its historical 9-line narrative to assert its claim, other countries use terms from international law. The United States is not a regional claimant, but constantly challenges China's claims through freedom of navigation operations, as well as military support for its Southeast Asian allies. Tensions have flared over fishing rights, energy exploration, and military activity. I chose this as my case study because it entails data on China's rhetoric across a long period of time, as well as towards different countries. The data is readily available online. And by focusing on one issue area, I control for issue variance and how that might affect China's rhetoric. For instance, I imagine China's rhetoric on economic and ideological issues to be very different. To answer my question, why China's rhetorical aggression varies, I drew from existing scholarship on physical aggression. Because the existing scholarship on diplomatic rhetoric still remains mostly anecdotal to this day. For instance, scholars will be describing specific incidents such as debates between Chinese diplomats and critics on Twitter during COVID-19. More recently, people have been looking at it empirically, but they still treat it as a uniformly escalating phenomenon, usually with a single starting point at 2019 as a policy directive under Xi Jinping. However, there is so much literature on what drives other forms of aggression, perhaps a bit too much for me to consider all of them. The poli-sci and IR students in this room are probably very familiar with what I've listed here, So just to give a few examples on how they specifically relate to China. For instance, Taylor Frevel argued that during territorial disputes, China uses military coercion more often when it feels that its claim is declining. Zhang in 2023 said that for China's military coercive actions on the South China Sea, they try to balance its reputation for resolve and the economic cost of coercion. And on rhetoric, Liao and Huang in 2023 did an empirical study on how China plays up its external crisis and foreign enemies in social media during protests. So while, especially for the physical aggressions, I do acknowledge that they are not exactly the same as diplomatic aggression, but I treat them similarly as acts of escalation and to signal resolve or willingness to back down to the adversary. So whatever constrains China from or encourages China to escalate should be similar factors. So for my hypotheses, I chose two of the things that I felt was most relevant in the South China Sea case. Well, first, economic interdependence. This theory posits that when two countries are economically dependent on each other, they tend to be more refrained from regression because trade ties prevent beneficial relations that countries are scared to sever if they get into a conflict. So applying it to my case, I hypothesize that when China is more economically dependent on country X in the particular year, its average aggression towards that country in that year should be lower. The second theory is diversionary war theory. So this theory posits that during periods of domestic unrest, such as economic slowdown or unhappiness about whoever is in power, leaders might look to external factors to either distract the public from what's happening internally or to create a rally around the flag effect to boost sentiments of nationalism. So most of the literature on this has been on electoral democracies. But more recently, people have been writing about how authoritarian regimes also have a similar effect because elites in authoritarian regimes could use popular sentiments as their excuse to go against the leader. So following this hypotheses, I hypothesize that when China faces more domestic problems, whether it's economic slowdown or major disasters, its average aggression towards our country in that year should be higher. This is especially prominent recently because a lot of scholars have been speculating that with China's economic growth slowdown, it's shifting from performance-based legitimacy, so legitimacy based in its economic performance and social stability, into a more nationalist one. So China versus the world. So for operationalizing my dependent variable, I first started with collecting data. I looked to China's foreign ministry website. And so there are two things I looked at. First, it's the written statements that they've published on the South China Sea issue. Second one is their daily press conference records. And I pulled out everything that is related to the issue from those. So in the end, I ended up with 496 statements and speeches. So these speeches range in time-wise from 2014 to 2023. Well, and why? It's actually because that's all I could find on the website, but more professionally, it actually coincides with the time of Xi Jinping as the president and Wang Yi as the foreign minister. So in a sense, it controls for leadership changes. And then I conducted sentiment analysis on other speeches I found. I used the BART classification model developed by Meta AI. And what it does is that it assigns an aggression score from 0 to 1 to each statement, which is essentially how likely a statement is likely to be considered aggressive. I can talk more about how this model works in more detail if anyone's interested in the Q&A session. So my dependent variable, it ends up being the average aggression score that China speaks to a particular country in a particular year. And to test my first hypotheses on economic dependence, I collected data on China's import and export with each country in a particular year. I then turned them into ratios of China's total import and export in that particular year, because in my case, relative dependence is more important than absolute dependence. And to test my second hypothesis on diversionary war theory, I collected data on indicators of social economic problems each year. There are two groups. Well, most obviously, indicators of economic slowdown that could be readily perceived by the public, such as unemployment, income, and consumption, but also indicators of disasters, how much land, people, and economic loss it has affected. For this one, I believe that disasters would affect social stability, and if not handled well, even people's trust towards the government. I then used panel data regression to find the relationship between China's aggression level and economic dependence on a given country. I controlled for both the time variable and the country variable to filter out any confounding variables. And on top of my regression results, I counted the frequency of statements to identify periods of heightened tensions. And I also find the most mentioned phrases in each speech. To do so, I'm looking for who China is talking to and what China actually talks about. I think one caveat of my thesis is that it's very difficult to verify how Chinese policymakers actually think and if their calculus is the way I assume to be. And since I am unable to interview anyone who actually does the policy making, I will make conjectures based on foreign ministry statements, expert and policy interviews, as well as media interpretations in the Chinese language. So first, I want to take a look at what these statements are mostly about. I first found that the number of foreign ministry statements only increased significantly during periods of notable conflicts. As we can see here, there is the South China Sea arbitration ruling between China and the Philippines, where they are both invoking international law to justify their claims. And there are also other more military but smaller conflicts later on. So what this graph generally tells us is that most speeches are actually responses to foreign developments. And when looking at the speeches qualitatively, I found that China are usually just responding to journalists' questions about new developments or foreign governments' accusation of Chinese actions. So this suggests that China uses wolf warrior diplomacy primarily to justify its existing claims and actions, perhaps as a strategic supplement to the gray zone activities on South China Sea, rather than to proactively create crisis for diverting public attention. I then looked at the most common phrases mentioned in China's speeches across all time, and particularly in times of heightened conflicts. So ignoring those nouns such as China, South China Sea, region, and country, the most prominent words include, perhaps surprisingly, peace, stability, and cooperation. In particular, it is important to know that even in the more assertive speeches, where China calls its counterpart to stop a certain actions with a threat, it often still includes a few phrases about peace and stability at the end. So Beijing's repeated emphasis on resolving disputes through bilateral negotiations rather than military confrontations, its goal to maintain a balanced diplomatic image. And in addition, it also shows that Beijing is quite risk-averse to potential escalations. So now moving on to my main hypothesis. My first regression on the estimated effects of economic dependence. The regression results indicate a strong relationship between China's import dependence on a country and its rhetorical aggressiveness. As China's dependence increases, its aggression decreases. This finding supports the theory that economic interdependence can moderate geopolitical tensions. However, I did notice a difference in significance levels between import and export dependency. And this perhaps suggests that in China's case, policymakers are more cautious about vulnerability in imports and exports. And as I've just mentioned, there is no way for me to fully justify my conjecture, but from my research, I did come up with a relatively logical proposal. This could be because China dominates global markets in a lot of critical goods, including rare earth elements, solar panels, and certain pharmaceutical precursors. So for countries like the United States, it is difficult for them to just all of a sudden decouple from China or even find another alternative very quickly. So China in the realm of exporting to other countries acts as a rule setter rather than a rule taker. China's export markets are also diversified enough that any one partner rarely holds a significant enough coercive power over Beijing. For instance, if the Philippines or the United States does decide to trade less with China, China could readily move to its partners in the European Union or in Central Asia. So because of this, Chinese policymakers are likely more aware and cautious about its import vulnerability rather than export ones, and less sensitive to changes in the export market. And moving on to my second hypothesis, well, unfortunately, none of the domestic problem indicators yielded statistically significant enough results for any relation to be established. And again, I came up with a few explanations to why diversionary theory fails to explain China's rhetorical aggression. Well, most obviously, China is an authoritarian regime, so it is probably less sensitive to public opinion, at least not in real time. So maybe they will respond, but they won't respond instantly. But more importantly, I argue that China's legitimacy today is still based on performance, its ability to deliver economic growth and social stability to its citizens. So while diverting people's sentiments towards an outside source might quickly divert their attention from domestic problems, in the longer run, it might actually backlash by harming economic prospects and cooperation with other countries, and thereby actually decreasing China's legitimacy. And again, as many of you probably know, China does have a very broad and sophisticated internal propaganda and public opinion control system. So it is unnecessary for them to divert to external sources and risking escalation. So finally, I would like just to recap my findings and what they mean for Chinese foreign policy making. The first conclusion is that China's reliance on import with a given country significantly moderates its rhetorical aggression, which verifies the economic dependence theory. In contrast, there is no significant relationship between China's rhetorical aggressiveness and indicators of domestic social economic problems. This finding nullifies my hypothesis on diversionary theory. And finally, summary data analysis suggests that the wolf warrior is more cautious than Western media has portrayed it to be. China's relatively balanced rhetoric reveals its effort to first reassure the international audience, second, give the adversary an opportunity to back down, and third, maintain China's image as a peaceful rising power. They again emphasize that China's rhetoric responds to foreign actions, supplements its physical actions, and not to divert the public. So all in all, while verifying China's policy-making mechanisms falls beyond the scope of this thesis, my findings suggest Chinese foreign policy's high responsiveness to international factors. They highlight China's priority to preserve economic prospects and regional stability. They also question the popular speculation that Chinese leaders are shifting from performance legitimacy to nationalist legitimacy. And I'd like to end with a quotation from an article written by Fu Ying, who was the China's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2010 and 2013, which captures the spirit of what I hope to convey in this thesis. China's wolf warrior diplomacy is not a nationalist function of the authoritarian black box. While rhetorical aggression is definitely nowhere close an indicator as physical aggression, there's still a handy way for Chinese policymakers to signal resolve or willingness to back down. And they tell equally as much about China's foreign policymaking calculus. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to open up for any comments or questions.
All right, thank you so much, Isabel. The first question, as always, goes to the faculty advisor. So Professor Tom, you can take it away.
Oh, all right. I didn't know I would be first, but congratulations on a terrific thesis and a very clear presentation. That was fabulous. Let me ask you about the implications of your thesis for current relations between the US and China. So you know that the United States seems to be in a bit of a trade war with China, and there's been increasing talk in the United States about the possibility of economic decoupling with China. Would your thesis predict that as a consequence of the trade war and moves toward economic decoupling, that we should also expect an increase in aggressive rhetoric regarding the South China Sea?
Yes, this is what my thesis predicts, but they could also both be a factor of the of a confounder, perhaps just general tension between US and China, right? So they both rise at the same time. And I think as for policy implication, my thesis wants to get at that China is not an authoritarian black box. It doesn't just make policies, as sometimes Western media portrays, just as the wolf warrior, as a nationalist, bad guy, but there is rational calculus making behind it. And perhaps for foreign governments, well, not my advice, but the implication could be they should only selectively decouple from China in critical sectors, for instance, maybe semiconductors, but definitely not in the most part, especially in what they import into China.
Raina, please.
Hi, so great job on the presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question to you is, you mentioned China's propaganda machine within the country. And so I guess my question is also, to what extent do you think there's also public awareness about these kinds of issues when they pop up? Personally, I remember when I visited Beijing a few years ago, I was told we don't talk about the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. And I don't know if that still stands. So I'm just asking, do you think that the public awareness around these issues is also a confounding factor?
I feel like I represent a very small sector of China's population, and I by no means represent the Chinese people. But in my past experience, I think people are generally aware of the South China Sea dispute, as there is a large maritime area south to China, and it's in dispute with its neighbors. So Chinese propaganda, 10 years ago, around 2012, 2015, they play a lot to the, it's a very catchy phrase. It's called 中国一点都不能少. China cannot lose 1 dash, referring to the 9 dash line. It cannot change any dash on the 9 dash line. But it's also a wordplay on how China cannot lose a tiny bit of its territory at all. So I think people are generally aware that this dispute is happening, but probably not exactly what's happening, what claims China are making or what legal disputes are going between these countries.
Great, thank you, Isabel. More questions? Yeah, can we have the question in the front?
Do I just say, or do I
Just say.
Maybe you can meet in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. It was a great presentation. I really liked how in your regressions you included the factors to account for possible confounding variables. One question about those is, could you talk a little bit about why for the first hypothesis you accounted for year, yet in the second one you did year squared as a variable?
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you for quizzing me on my methodology. So my first hypothesis, so basically the shape of the independent variables are just different, right? In my first hypothesis, I'm looking at economic dependence, so to both by country and by year. So I have to control for both country variance and time variance. But for my second hypothesis, it's just about China. So it doesn't differ between countries. And my only changing variable is probably time. So if I also control for time as a dummy variable, then it will probably take away too much of the variance.
All right, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Can you just hand the microphone right to the front? Thank you.
Great job on your presentation. I was curious. So apart from the other two hypotheses that you discussed in your presentation, were there any other hypotheses that you considered but didn't end up pursuing? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think to me, relative power is definitely a very interesting one, because on the one hand, one could argue that with China's rising power, it's probably, more confident to use stronger words. But on the other hand, others could argue that China needs stronger rhetoric when it feels more insecure because it has to deter its adversary. So I was hoping to look at that, but again, it's very difficult to see in this case because it has remained relatively constant over the period of time I was looking at. China has always been stronger than its neighbors, but closing its peer to the United States. And another one I was hoping to look at was leadership changes, because in the literature on authoritarian policymaking, leaders do play a significant role. But for that question, I would probably have to look at more data. So before Xi Jinping and way back.
Right, more questions. There's a question behind you, right?
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation, Isabel. So I think your main finding is that you found correlation between economic dependency and aggression. Do you have thoughts on which way is a more probable causal link, whether it's economic dependency that's more likely to cause more aggression, or more aggressive rhetoric that causes economic independence?
Yeah, that is a great question. And to verify it, I probably have to include it in my next steps to, try it in reverse. But logically speaking, I still think that rhetorical aggression economic dependence leads to rhetorical aggression, because if you think about it, if China speaks very aggressively about one country and that country has to respond, right? It might not respond in the form of just a very formal, strong sanction, because that's not worth it. So what it might does is that, it might encourage companies to decouple from China, especially in light of rising tensions. But then it takes time for these companies to find new clients and new markets. So what I envision, if aggression causes a decline in economic dependence, the decline would happen in the next year, right? So in T+1. But so that's just intuition and logic, but to test that, I could probably do a lag time regression in the reverse.
Right. You're so effective in your question answering. We still have time if there's one more question. Yeah, to Rose in the back, please.
I just had a simple.
Yeah, there's table
thank
mics
you.
anyway.
Yeah, I just had a
Go ahead.
simple technical question. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, of course, has their statements online in their officially translated English plus Chinese. Did you use both of those, or did you just use the Chinese or just the English official translation?
Yeah, so I looked both at them just to see that the translation actually matches. But I mainly looked at the Chinese one because, especially for my second hypothesis on diversionary war, they will be facing the Chinese public.
Right, got it. Did you find any nuance that was a kind of steady state nuance between the two?
I think so. First of all, Chinese doesn't translate like exactly into English, but the general sense is similar. So if it includes a threat in the Chinese, it will also include a threat in the English.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you.
All right, then please join me in thanking Isabel for. And then after 1 or 2 minutes changeover, we'll have Michael Murray presenting on West Africa's democratic defender, reassessing ECOWAS in the age of geopolitical fracture.
So Michael, very interesting. I don't know, maybe like I love the shout out.
Time out.
It's like saying way at the back, so I just did a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Love this, Michael.
I guess it's fair. You already. Yeah.
My guy please ask you to change quickly, and then if you want to stay outside, please not chat right in front of the door, and then change back in if you want to listen to the next presentation so we can get started.
Yeah, that's all.
Hi.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Give it another 20 seconds so everyone
Whenever
you feel the room is
Yeah.
Whenever you feel the room is quiet enough, take it away.
Can use this to
I
flip
know.
your slide.
Okay.
Point.
Does this also? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's the Google slide.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. All right. We good to get started?
Yeah, floor is yours.
Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Murray, and today I'm going to discuss why the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, sometimes succeeds, but other times fails to restore constitutionality within its member states. To start, I'm going to give a brief background on ECOWAS. ECOWAS was established in 1975 to promote economic integration and collective self-sufficiency among its member states. By the 1990s, however, the organization started to assume a more proactive role regarding peace, security, and democratic governance, recognizing that sustainable economic development required political stability in order to succeed. A key milestone in the organization's evolution was its adoption of the Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance in 2001. This protocol laid out three fundamental principles which are relevant today. The first was the protocol mandated that all ascensions to power must be made through free, fair, and transparent elections. Secondly, the protocol mandates that, or stipulates that ECOWAS will have zero tolerance for power obtained or maintained by unconstitutional means. And finally, the protocol requires that, that every military force be apolitical and under the command of a legally constituted civilian authority. Now, through this protocol, ECOWAS established itself as a norm setter in West Africa and established its authority to intervene when member states face constitutional crises or democratic collapses. This has underpinned ECOWAS's intervention in numerous political transitions across the region over the past 24 years, although not always successfully, which leads me to my research question today, which is, why has ECOWAS succeeded in reversing unconstitutional seizures or retentions of power in some cases, but not others? Now, to answer this question, I conducted the first comprehensive systematic review of every instance in which ECOWAS intervened to reverse such acts within its member states. Using Jonathan Powell and Clayton Thine's global coup dataset as a foundation, I developed a list of cases using the following parameters. The first is that there was an unconstitutional seizure or retention of power. In most instances, this means that the military seized power from the incumbent government, or the incumbent leader refused to relinquish power after losing election or experiencing term limits. The second parameter was that ECOWAS officially opposed and then actively sought to reverse this unconstitutional act using a mixture of diplomatic, economic, and/or military means. Now, applying these parameters results in a universe of 13 cases that span 20 years, starting in 2003, and cover 8 ECOWAS member states. Next, I classify each case as either a successful or failed intervention. And I defined success quite straightforwardly as constitutional order either being restored immediately or within an agreed upon timeframe. And conversely, failure as constitutional order neither being restored in the near nor long term. Now, applying these definitions, I code 9 of my 13 cases as successes and the remaining 4 as failures. Now, for each case, I focus on 2 independent variables: how ECOWAS responded to the intervention and how the international community responded to ECOWAS's efforts and the extent to which they aligned with and supported its measures. Now, today I want to focus primarily on the second variable, which is the degree of international support for ECOWAS's efforts. In my research, I assessed the positions of 8 key international actors for each case. First, I examined the role of the regional hegemon, Nigeria, West Africa's largest economy and military power, and also a longtime leader of ECOWAS. Second, I analyzed the responses of 3 key international organizations: The first is the African Union, which is the continent's primary political body. The second is the European Union, which is West Africa's largest trading partner. And the third is the United Nations, in particular the United Nations Security Council, which is the world's forum for matters of peace and security. Finally, I assessed the positions of four major powers. The first is the United States, which was the major global power for much of the period under study. The second was France, one of the region's former colonizers, and a force still present in the region. The third was China, a major trading and investing partner for West Africa. And the fourth was Russia, which has assumed a greater security presence in West Africa in recent years. In each intervention, I evaluated the 8 actors' public statements and actions in response to ECOWAS's efforts. I then classified their positions using one of 5 codes. Strongly supportive meant that the actor consistently supported all or most of ECOWAS's major actions in response to an unconstitutional seizure or retention of power. Moderately supportive means that the actor endorsed some, but not all, of ECOWAS's actions, but they did not actively oppose any of them. Neutral means that there was just no clear position that the actor took. Moderately unsupportive means the actor opposed or criticized some of ECOWAS's major actions while accepting and supporting others. This means they had a mixed record and with at least one act of clear opposition. And strongly unsupportive, as you can assume, means that they opposed all or nearly all of ECOWAS's major positions. Now, to illustrate how these actors' support or opposition can influence the success or failure of an ECOWAS intervention, I want to start by comparing 2 contrasting cases: the Gambia in 2017, which is regarded as one of ECOWAS's greatest successes, and Niger in 2023, which is considered perhaps its most clear-cut and embarrassing failure. Now we jump to the Gambia to start. So in December of 2016, Yahya Jammeh lost his bid for a 5th term and in a surprise upset. Even more surprisingly, however, he initially accepted the results before reversing course a few weeks later and insisting he was the only one who could lead the nation. ECOWAS immediately condemned Jammeh's bid to remain in power and dispatched high-level envoys consisting of Nigeria and Ghana to negotiate his peaceful exit. From the start, ECOWAS made clear that it was prepared to use military force to remove him if he wouldn't step down voluntarily. ECOWAS enjoyed broad support from international organizations. The African Union explicitly endorsed its use of all necessary means to remove Jammeh. Moreover, the European Union, while not explicitly endorsing military action, did say that Jammeh risked serious consequences if he refused to go peacefully. The UN Security Council, interestingly enough, fully endorsed ECOWAS's efforts by, quote, political means first to remove Jammeh, which left the door open to using military action should diplomacy fail, a key open-ended language. Now, among the major powers, the United States endorsed outright the military intervention. France did as well, and it also helped to craft that open-ended language that I previously mentioned. And both China and Russia, while encouraging diplomacy, voted for that resolution. However, I will stipulate that Russia, because of its preference for diplomacy, was the reason the Security Council didn't just outright endorse military action. So a sign of modest opposition, but it still endorsed the ultimate resolution. Nigeria was all in on the effort. Its president co-led the initial mediation efforts, and when those failed, the country switched to supporting the military initiative with troops and aircraft, as well as naval ships off the coast of the Gambia. As a result, ultimately, ECOWAS troops intervened once Jammeh made it clear he would not leave on his own accord. And he quickly fled the country. ECOWAS troops faced no resistance, and they were able, as a result, to safely inaugurate Adama Barrow, who was Jammeh's duly elected successor, marking a great success for ECOWAS. So if we look at it all together, I code Nigeria and the African Union as strongly supportive because they endorsed military action explicitly. I endorse, the European Union didn't, so I downgrade it slightly to moderately supportive. The United Nations for the same reason. The United States and France did support military intervention, while China and Russia, or China at least, was moderately supportive. Russia, I do downgrade slightly to moderately unsupportive in the orange, because it didn't outright oppose military intervention, but it did stop the UN Security Council from endorsing said action. So as we can see here, ECOWAS in this case enjoyed broad support across the international community. Now we switch to a contrasting case in Niger in 2023, where the military overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum, citing his inability to squash Islamic insurgents in the country's northern region. ECOWAS similarly condemned this coup right away. They imposed stiff economic and diplomatic sanctions and immediately threatened military action if the junta refused to relinquish power within 7 days. This time, however, ECOWAS did not enjoy the same level of support for military action. While Nigeria's President Tinubu was strongly in favor of strong sanctions and even a military intervention, Nigeria's Senate, which would have to approve Nigeria's participation in any military action, was firmly in favor of diplomacy and ruled out military force. Among international organizations, the African Union suspended Niger, but they did not endorse military action. Similarly, the EU cut off over $500 million of assistance to the country, but still did not endorse military intervention by ECOWAS. And the UN Security Council this time left no wiggle room and made clear that they only support ECOWAS's diplomatic efforts and not one step further. Among major powers, the United States actually waited 3 months to even declare that a coup had officially occurred, most likely owing to the fact that the US had 2 very important drone bases in the country at the time that it worried about losing. France stood on an island by itself and strongly and loudly endorsed military force and volunteered to help if needed. While China, like in the case of the Gambia, favored a political resolution of the crisis in keeping with its preference for diplomacy and its general non-interference in other states' business. Russia, however, did take a firm stand this time, with the Russian Foreign Ministry warning ECOWAS that a military intervention would destabilize the region and it would also threaten to undermine the ECOWAS, the institution itself, a very firm warning that had a chilling effect on ECOWAS's decision whether to use force. As a result, ECOWAS did not ultimately use force, and its sanctions alone did not prove to be sufficient to remove the junta from power, and as a result, it remains in control of the country to this day. Now, when we sum it all up, we see that Nigeria, the African Union, European Union, United Nations, and the United States were all only moderately supportive since they did not endorse military action. France, again, was the only one in green, strongly supporting that action if needed, while China was consistent from the Gambia, but Russia we see dipped all the way down to dark red as strongly unsupportive since it actively, publicly, and consistently opposed ECOWAS's push for military force. So we see here a deep drop in support and the presence for the first time of opposition. Now, when we compare these 2 cases, we see that the main difference is a drop in support from Nigeria, the African Union, and the United States. This is the main difference between the 2, which have all historically been strong supporters of ECOWAS. We see that combined with growing opposition from Russia was the main difference between these cases and in the outcome that ECOWAS experienced. Now, as these interventions demonstrate, the level of international support appears to be a key determinant in whether ECOWAS succeeds in a given intervention. Now, to further test and prove this claim, I want to now compare 2 more cases that are more closely linked in Mali. One is a successful intervention in 2020, followed just 9 months later by an unsuccessful one in 2021. Now, this comparison is especially revealing because it controls for both the target country and the time period, as the coups and subsequent interventions occurred within a short span of time and under largely similar domestic conditions. Yet ECOWAS achieved in these 2 cases starkly different results. Now, first with background on Mali in 2020, we see in August of 2020, a Colonel Assimi Goïta seizes power with the military in response to the country's worsening economic and security conditions. As a result, ECOWAS responds by suspending Mali from the bloc, imposing economic sanctions. The junta and ECOWAS eventually agreed to a 12-month transition period, they start with that and eventually settle on an 18-month transition period and appoint interim president and prime minister, at which point ECOWAS satisfied lifts sanctions. In this response, Nigeria was strongly supportive. President Buhari, who's a known champion of ECOWAS, urged the entire international community to help Mali return sanity to its government. Among international organizations, the AU suspended Mali and endorsed ECOWAS's transition plan. The European Union condemned the coup and also suspended its military assistance to Mali. And the UN Security Council endorsed both ECOWAS's sanctions and its diplomatic efforts, a key win for the bloc. Among the major powers, the United States suspended military assistance and endorsed the plan. France condemned the coup, but did not suspend military assistance, which I'll come back to. And in this case, China and Russia both separately condemned the coup, and they also supported the Security Council's endorsement of ECOWAS. So quite strong support from those 2 actors. So when we sum it all up, we see a lot of green on the board, minus France because it maintained its military assistance to Mali despite the coup. But we see otherwise very strong support across the international community, and crucially, no opposition from any figure. Now we jump forward 9 months to 2021, in which case Goita returns. He arrests the interim president and prime minister and declares himself the new head of the transitional government. ECOWAS immediately again suspends Mali following the same playbook and continues to engage with the junta in the hope that they can get back on the transition timeline. After the junta delays elections, ECOWAS imposes targeted sanctions first on the junta leaders. When those prove ineffective in January 2022, after another delay in elections, ECOWAS imposes more sweeping economic sanctions on the entire country. And then finally, ECOWAS and the junta by July of 2022 reach a shaky deal to have a 24-month transition period. Now, Nigeria, in this case, Buhari maintained his consistent support for ECOWAS. They participated both in the mediation efforts and in the sanctions against Mali. As for international organizations, the African Union was consistent in that it suspended Mali and sent mediators to help. The EU also imposed sanctions after the junta delayed elections and encouraged compliance with the transition plan. The United Nations, however, did not endorse ECOWAS's sanctions despite a request from the regional bloc, which I'll get to in just a moment. The United States was similarly supportive, imposing its own targeted sanctions. France this time did increase its support, finally suspending military aid. But China this time, while still supporting ECOWAS's diplomatic efforts, blocked the UN from endorsing its sanctions regime, saying that it wanted more time for diplomacy to work. And it was not alone in this effort. Russia also joined China in blocking the UN from endorsing ECOWAS's sanctions, but then it went even a step further. We started to see in September 2021 that the junta hired 1,000 Wagner Group mercenaries, a group that is closely linked to the Kremlin. And then increasingly in October 2021, the Russian military itself delivered 4 helicopters and a lot of ammunition to the Malian armed forces, followed in January 2022 by Russia sending 400 military trainers. So we see here that not only did Russia stop the international community's coalition behind ECOWAS, but it also increased and deepened its partnership with the Malian regime. As a result to this day, the 24-month transition period has come and gone, and with no success, while Goita, pictured here on the right, increases his own ties and Mali's ties with Russia, embodied in President Vladimir Putin here on the left. Now, as we see, despite there being strong support from Nigeria, the African Union, European Union, United States, and France, that opposition from China and Russia proved crucial. And we see here that despite there being 5 out of 8 actors actively supportive, there's a certain asymmetry where the opposition of a few can overcome the strong support of the many. And if we compare these two cases again, we see that the big difference is a drop in support from China and Russia playing the spoiler role. And as a result, the United Nations also sees a drop off because of the actions of these 2 permanent members of the Security Council. Now, this phenomenon I found to be true across all the cases. So among the successful interventions, on average, 6 out of 8 of the actors were strongly supportive of ECOWAS, and 0 actors were strongly unsupportive. But in the case of the failed interventions, we saw that average drop to only 3 out of 8 of the actors. And in 3 out of 4 of the cases, we saw that Russia was strongly unsupportive. So we see here that to be a real strong correlation between international support and opposition and the success or failure of a given intervention. Now, I want to take a moment to zoom in on Russia here with this graph, which I find quite illustrative. In this sense, we see that Russia's opposition to ECOWAS's efforts are more recent than not. We see that up until 2021, Russia consistently supported ECOWAS in its moves to restore constitutional order. But starting in 2021, at the same time that ECOWAS started to experience a string of losses, Russia also started to become less supportive of the bloc, suggesting a strong correlation between Russia's opposition and the bloc's decline in effectiveness. Now, with the couple minutes I have left, I want to briefly touch on how the fact that international support is a greater determinant of success than the type of sanctions that ECOWAS applies. Now, to illustrate this dynamic that I found, I will contrast ECOWAS's successful reversal of a 2012 coup in Mali with its failure in Niger in 2023. Now, in both cases, ECOWAS suspended the target country, imposed travel restrictions on the junta's leaders, suspended aid to the country, froze the assets of both the state and the individual junta leaders, and it closed its borders between member states and the targeted country. And lastly, in both cases, ECOWAS threatened military intervention. Now, the only differences between these two are notable but minor, in that in Mali, ECOWAS also withdrew its member state ambassadors, and in the case of Niger, it imposed a total commercial and financial embargo. But as I mentioned, these two cases, while having similar sanctions regimes, did not have the same outcome. because although they imposed identically harsh sanctions, ECOWAS succeeded in Mali, but not in Niger. Crucially, while ECOWAS's responses to both were comparable, the international community's response was not. In Mali's case, ECOWAS enjoyed strong backing from 7 of the 8 observed actors, as well as at least moderate support from the 8th, Russia. Whereas in the case of Niger, as we know, ECOWAS faced reduced support from 5 of its traditional backers and active opposition from China and especially Russia. Now, this contrast suggests that the success of ECOWAS interventions depends less on the type of sanctions that ECOWAS applies and more on the breadth and support of the breadth and depth of international support behind them, as we can see here with the difference. And this was true across the cases in the sense that I found that ECOWAS did impose in 3 out of 4 of the cases quite strict by the average standard sanctions in those 4 cases. And yet they still failed in them. And so I found no positive correlation between sanctions and success, whereas I said I found a stronger correlation between international support and success. Now, to briefly wrap up with my main conclusions, the first, of course, being, as I've mentioned many times, is that ECOWAS has turned out to entirely depend on international support. In looking at these 13 case studies, ECOWAS has only succeeded in cases in which it had near unanimous active support from the international community. It's never been able to succeed when it faced opposition from even one of these 8 actors. So again, showing that it's quite fragile in its independent coercive power. The second one, as I've alluded to, but get into more in the writing, is that obviously Russia has emerged as a key spoiler in the region because its opposition was tied to 3 out of 4 of the failed interventions, suggesting that it is becoming ECOWAS's greatest challenge in the region. Now, as Russia continues to play an increasingly active role in West Africa, we can expect, based on these results, to see ECOWAS's power to reverse unconstitutional acts decrease even further, as it is so dependent on that unanimity of support behind it. So with that, I thank everyone and I'm excited to take your questions. Thank you.
Please join me at the table, Michael. And again, the first question goes to the faculty advisor. And I think I've spotted Professor Cohen in the room. So yeah, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It's a really interesting thesis that you've put together. And could you sort of look in your crystal ball for us on the basis of your research? And how do you see the role of ECOWAS going forward, given the sort of political reconfigurations that have been happening in West Africa, and particularly in the Sahel, with France, Russia, and the United States all sort of shifting in their position?
Well, I can't say that it's positive. I think not only did, as I mentioned in the presentation, you see Russia playing an increasingly spoiler role, but you also see that ECOWAS is starting to disintegrate, which I wasn't able to touch on this presentation. But as of January of this year, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have all left the regional bloc. So it is now significantly weakened as a result. They've created their own rival group. And so I think that you see there that already it is starting to fracture. And its strength really was having that cohesiveness in the beginning. So losing that is a big blow. I think also ECOWAS, I didn't have access to the data that I would want to study it in this thesis, but ECOWAS's reputation across the region has also taken a hit. It's become associated very strongly with French neocolonialism. And as a result, its popularity has fallen quite considerably. So I think the average person in the region has probably lost faith in ECOWAS and sees it more as a stooge of the West than as kind of its defender and promoter. And so I think that for all those reasons, ECOWAS, its heydays are probably over. I think it's exceeded a lot in the past 24 years when it had a really permissive international environment that allowed it to be super activist. But now that time is over and Russia is being more assertive, you start to see that it can't stand the winds.
Great. Josh, we have a table mic. Thanks.
Great presentation, Michael. I'm curious, you pointed out there's the more influence from Russia in the region, kind of the less like the ECOWAS is succeed. I'm curious, what effect do you think of this kind of bipolarity or multipolarity in the region has on just the likelihood that more coups will occur? You have this positive feedback loop of the declining influence and role of ECOWAS. More coups. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do the research into what would cause the coups, just them. But I think Russia's support for military-led governments probably would increase the likelihood of coups, because crucially what Russia provides is an alternative to France and the US. Because in all these countries, as I kind of alluded to, they have these really problematic insurgencies, Islamic insurgencies. And so they've been really relying on the US and France for security assistance to try to tamp those down. But what Russia allows them to do is to get that assistance from them with no conditions. They'll allow them to be undemocratic and still provide them with the guns and the bullets and the ships and the aircraft. And so I think that I would say I would expect Russia's presence and its kind of its permissiveness for these military-led governments would probably encourage other militaries to say, we can take power and we can still maintain that kind of external support that we need to survive.
Samia in the back, and then Isabel.
That was a great presentation, Michael. I'm really curious, how did you settle on international support as a key causal factor? Was it because of current rhetoric around it being a neo-imperial power that kind of drew you to think about how European states and Western states might be influencing its action, or what brought you to that? Because I think you've provided a lot of really convincing evidence about how it is a key determinant.
Thank you. I think it definitely, I was drawn to in the fact that I was curious whether ECOWAS was a paper tiger, so to speak. Was it really just a cover for Western powers and their associates to influence it, or did it have its own independent strength? And I mean, my conclusion is no, it doesn't. So part of it was wanting to see is this, because ECOWAS was kind of heralded as kind of the West African solution to West African problems. It was kind of a model example of a regional bloc that was successful in actually having on the ground tangible results in terms of constitutional protections. And so wanting to see, could I challenge that narrative and disprove it based off recent events? But I also think it was more practicality too, whereas just with all these international actors, there was a lot of primary data. I could find their statements, their resolutions, their suspensions of aid, their sanctions. And so I could really trust that I was getting the best data. Whereas other variables would have required, I wouldn't have been able to access the same kind of original data to know that I was finding the best results.
Thank you.
Isabel. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was so great. I learned a lot. So you pointed out that Russia suddenly shifted its support for ECOWAS in 2021. And we do see a pretty big dip, from very high up to no support at all. Why do you think that is? Could it possibly be linked to, what else is happening in Russia? Because 2021, right, in Ukraine.
Yeah, I was anticipating asking that question. I'm not an expert in Russian foreign policy, so I don't know necessarily what would have changed on their end. But I do think a part of it, probably a large part of it, is just opportunism. Because as I mentioned, at the same time, starting in 2020, there's because of COVID, there's kind of bleak economic conditions. People are there's popular unrest. There's also a big increase in anti-French sentiment, and so I think at least part of it is Russia saw an opportunity where the population was turning on France, and so I think they saw an opportunity to replace them. Because you see at the same time as COVID, economic deterioration, a rise in anti-French sentiment, and at the same time worsening insurgencies in all these countries. And so I think those factors together, they saw that there was an openness to an alternative. And since they hadn't had such a big presence yet in the region, people could believe that they would be different. Yeah.
Last question goes to Raina.
Yeah, so I noticed you talked about the Security Council, and then you talked about 4 of the P5.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question for you is, for the UK, was it just generally consistent with what the US and France were doing, or did it have any kind of outliers within the case data? It's also just rare to hear colonization and not the British. So
yes, I mean the phrase that I've heard in the literature, is the difference between France and Britain as colonizers is the British left and the French kind of stayed, even after decolonization, or at least more viscerally. And so I think what in these cases the UK really didn't have. I didn't find that they were a variable in many of these cases. They were more involved in the 90s when there were some peacekeeping issues in some of their former colonies. But a lot of these cases happened in French former colonies. And also France has just tried to maintain a more active presence even into the 21st century. So yeah, the UK just kind of wasn't as on the map as France was.
Fantastic. Then please join me in thanking Michael for